As many of you know, mindfulness practices are now being used successfully to treat everything, from depression, anxiety, and alienation to ADHD and financial difficulties. You name it, and there's a mindfulness-oriented treatment for it. And while mindfulness practices are extremely useful for a wide variety of problems, if we take up these practices with some seriousness, they can have some unexpected effects. In fact, some unwanted effects. One of which is a rather radical reappraisal of who we think we are and what our life is all about. And this effect, while initially somewhat unsettling, can actually be quite liberating and quite useful. What we discover is that our sense of being a coherent, separate self, a sort of a sense of continuity of consciousness, is actually something of a delusion. And the closer we look, the harder it is to find that elusive self. And this has many important implications for psychotherapy. And those are what we're going to talk about today. So in Buddhist traditions, which many of you know are one of the traditions that have developed mindfulness practices, and of all the traditions that have developed them, it's the Buddhist traditions that we draw upon most in Western psychotherapeutic uses of mindfulness practices. There it says that if we do these practices, we'll have a glimpse into anatta. And so what does that mean? That is this sense that there isn't some solid self in there. You know, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. A more modern update of that might be, I have a to-do list, therefore I am. Or perhaps, I have likes on my Facebook account, therefore I am. What we find, though, is that Descartes was onto something. That thinking is one of the ways that we construct a sense of separate self. In fact, our sense of self is maintained by this constant inner chatter, by the way that we talk to ourselves about ourselves all day long. And sometimes that conversation is very mundane. You know, I think I'll get the salmon over the wilted spinach. That would be so healthy. Well, maybe not. The lasagna looks so good. But it can go from that to existential fears like, what do I do if the lump is malignant? When we're getting a biopsy. And all day long we listen to these thoughts, these words passing through our mind. And of course, we come to assume that, well, I must exist. The star of this show, the hero of this drama, must be a very important person, and he must be there. What we see from mindfulness practice is actually it's just an endless series of sub-vocalized words. These words arising in consciousness, these narratives playing out. And we see that it's happening against the backdrop of the kaleidoscope of all different bodily sensations as well as external sensory experiences of sight, of sound, of everything else that appears in consciousness. And what we notice is attention goes from one to the other. It goes from the breath to a sound, to an itch on the scalp, to the image of a friend, to remembering an upsetting email. But what we don't find is the little homunculus inside. And I'm sorry, I'm not saying next slide, so we should be on the homunculus slide here. We never find the little man or woman inside who is having all of these experiences in consciousness. Rather, we just see this ongoing flux of mental contents. Next slide, please. And people have tracked what's going on neurobiologically. And what's happening when we're talking to ourselves about ourselves and thinking about what we like and what we don't like and thinking about others is there's the activation of an area of the brain called the default mode network. And this is what's activated when we're not actively pursuing desires or actively trying to achieve some goal. And while this default mode network is activated, we're thinking a great deal about who we are, how we compare to others, what's going to happen to us, and we're remembering things that we've done and planning for the future. And it turns out that it is the activation of this default mode network that is an important part of developing a sense of me or I. So next slide. Who am I? It turns out that there are two types of self-reference that cognitive psychologists have identified. One of them is called the narrative focus, and this is when we talk to ourselves about ourselves and particularly talk about our enduring traits. You know, I'm a nice guy, I'm a smart guy, I'm a dumb guy, I'm a mean guy, I'm a father, I'm a husband. all of these kinds of discussions of ourselves in narrative mode. And this involves the words that are occurring in our mind all day long. The other mode, experiential focus, is actually simply noticing the moment-to-moment kaleidoscope of inner experience, the itch, the ache, a thought arising and passing, and the like. And we know that when people are involved in this experiential focus, which those of you who are meditators will recognize is indeed what we're trying to cultivate during mindfulness practice, there's a lot of activation of the insula, which is the part of the brain which has many functions, as all brain parts do, but it seems particularly involved in interoception, in noticing the moment-to-moment sensations in the body. Well, people have studied what happens to elements of the default mode network when we take up mindfulness practice. And in fact, what they've done is they've set up experiments. There's a now classic study out of 2007 by Norman Farb and Zindel Siegel, both at the University of Toronto, where what they did was they trained people in both experiential mode and narrative mode. In other words, they train them to be able to be with moment-to-moment sensations and experience, as well as to talk about themselves, to describe themselves in adjectives and the like. And what they found is once they had given people 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction training, basically an 8-week mindfulness course, what happened was people were much more able to access this experiential mode. And what they found was they were looking at the medial prefrontal cortex, which is one of the elements in the default mode network, which links these subjective experiences across time and holds memory of things like self-traits, traits of similar others, reflected self-knowledge, and future aspirations. And what happened was the people who had gone through these courses had much less activation in the medial prefrontal cortex, so much less activation in this part of the default mode network when they were in experiential mode. They were able to shift from narrative mode to experiential mode. So what all this is saying is when we train ourselves in mindfulness, we actually learn how to step out of the thought stream. We learn how to move from our preoccupation with thoughts about me to other thoughts. And to other levels of experience. So now there are four basic ways in which glimpsing anatta, or coming to see this no self, can have effects on our understanding and perception of the world, as well as effects on psychotherapy. And we will review these four in the course of the presentation. And why are we going to do this? Well, personally, I'm very moved to address this because it's amazing to me to see how often my mind is generating worries about myself, how I compare to others, how I'm doing, even right now as I'm doing this presentation. Is it going well? Are you guys going to be enjoying it? Am I going to be doing a good job at this or not? And this is happening despite having been on the planet for some 6 decades, at least 4 of which have been really pretty dedicated to psychological inquiry and spiritual practice, and still preoccupied with how am I doing, what do others think about me, and what do I think about myself? So if there's some way to get freedom from this, I'm very interested. Clinically, also, I notice that so many of my patients are suffering with similar kinds of concerns. They're suffering with, how am I doing? Am I doing well enough? Either comparing themselves to some inner standard or comparing themselves to other people out there. So if we can get some freedom from this, this could be quite useful to us. And so the 4 areas are increased affect tolerance, the ability to feel feelings more deeply and tolerate stronger feelings, radical acceptance of parts, so we're no longer having to push some parts out of awareness and hold on to others, and I'll explain all of these. Freedom from self-esteem concerns. Wow, wouldn't it be nice to go through a day not so worried about how I'm doing? And finally, developing a deeper connection to others through doing this. So let's dive into affect tolerance. There's a Zen teaching story, and this is the picture of the slide, please, of the sword, please, next slide, in which there's a marauding general who has come to town, and this guy is really sadistic, and he and his troops are doing horrible things. They're killing able-bodied men and boys, they're destroying crops, they're burning buildings, they're raping women. It's horrible. And this general has it in his mind that he really, really wants to vanquish this town. And he gets it that they revere their Zen master. So what does he do? He takes his horse and he rides it up the hillside right into the main hall of the Zen temple. And there, sitting on his zafu, on his meditation cushion, is this little old man, the Zen master. And this general takes his bloody sword and he raises it over the head of the Zen master. And he says, "Don't you realize I could run you through with the sword without blinking an eye?" And at that moment, the Zen master looks up and he says, "Yes, and I, sir, can be run through with the sword without blinking an eye." And it's said that at that moment, the general becomes flustered, disoriented, and leaves town. Now, I'm not suggesting this is always going to work as a military intervention, but it speaks to one of the effects of meditation practices broadly and mindfulness practices in particular. The capacity to be with and manage pain. Now, any of you who've done mindfulness practice for any kind of extended period will notice that all sorts of pain arises when we do the practices. Simply sitting still for a while can cause pains in the neck or the back or the buttocks, etc., the knees. Emotional pain arises, right? Thoughts and feelings come up that aren't so pleasant. A very minimum restlessness usually arises, and we learn how to sit through that. And the more we do these practices, the stronger becomes this muscle, if you will, of being able to stay with discomfort. And this can be enormously important when learning to deal with feelings. And that's because feelings, emotions, are largely somatic events accompanied by thoughts and sometimes images. So let's look at the slide that says selfing and affect tolerance together here. And what I want you to do, just for a moment, if you will, is generate a little bit of, let's start with sadness. Bring up an image or a thought that creates some sadness. And can you point to where in your body you feel that? For me, it's a little bit in the throat, a little bit in the chest, a feeling in the eyes. And now let's go to anger. Generate a little bit of anger. If nothing comes to mind, just think of the other political party, whoever they are for you right now. And feel that anger. And where do you feel that in the body? For me, it's a tension in the back of the neck, shoulders, a little bit of heart racing more quickly. And fear. Generate a little fear. Where's that? That for me, it's chest again. And we could go through other things like joy, and I won't ask you about lust. But all of these emotions exist as bodily sensations. So if we develop a capacity to be with pleasant and unpleasant bodily sensations without needing to flee them, we are going to develop a great deal more affect tolerance. Now, there's yet another way that mindfulness practice, and this ties into anatta directly, that mindfulness practice can help us with strong affect. Let's say I've got a friend and he's done me dirty after I was really, really good to him. And I'm going to have a thought. I can't believe you did that to me after all I've done for you. And every time I have that thought, there's going to be the somatic experience of anger. And of course, every time I have the arousal of the somatic experience of anger, it's going to generate more angry thoughts. And this loop is going to just continue. What a jerk. How'd you do that? You know, I'm never going to help you again, etc. If, on the other hand, we're doing a good deal of mindfulness practice, it's going to unfold very differently. I'm going to be here. I'm going to notice the anger arising in the mind body. I'm even going to perhaps have images of decapitating former friend leaping through the mind's eye. But the whole thing is going to feel like an impersonal process, simply thoughts arising, bodily sensations arising, images arising, because I've come to experience things in experiencing mode or experiential mode, and to be able to see it all as this kaleidoscope of unfolding experience. And if I can do that, it's going to be much easier to work with the anger. You know, cognitive scientists are now trying to determine, so how long does an emotion last if not reinforced by a thought? What would you guess? The best guess seems to be around 90 seconds, that there's this bodily arousal, but if it's not reinforced by the thought, It comes and goes and it dissipates. So this could give us tremendous freedom in being able to deal with powerful emotions when they arise. And indeed, clinically, I found that it's the case as well as in my personal practice. So now let's look at the second way in which mindfulness practices can bring us to the realization of anatta, and this realization of anatta, or no consistent, coherent self, can be freeing and can change our psychotherapy practices. You know, I have a friend who's a minister and also a psychologist, and he pointed out to me many years ago that polytheism rather than monotheism is the norm, and it's been the norm throughout human history. We look at the Greek and Roman gods, and there's a different god to represent each aspect of the personality. Or we look at Christian traditions. For example, in the Catholic Church, there are all these different saints, all of which represent some aspect, usually some positive aspect of the personality, such as virtue or faith or generosity or compassion. And the Tibetan Buddhists, for example, have a whole pantheon themselves of bodhisattvas representing different wholesome aspects of the personality. And of course, we know that animistic cultures project onto the natural world all sorts of things, the spirit of love, the spirit of peace, the spirit of anger, the spirit of jealousy, etc. And why is this happening? This is happening because if we actually mindfully start to pay attention to what's going on in consciousness, we start to notice that there isn't one individual there, but rather there's quite a variety of parts, if you will, or sub-personalities interacting with each other. And many therapeutic schools have noticed this. Jung, certainly, in his description of the anima and the animus and the shadow and the persona and the like, was describing these different parts. Roberto Assagioli, psychosynthesis, deals with these different parts. And in a more modern context, Dick Schwartz, having developed internal family systems, helps these parts to talk to one another. And in so doing, in noticing that, for example, for me, angry Ron is so different from compassionate Ron, who is so different from needy Ron, who is so different from frightened Ron, who is so different from joyous Ron or loving Ron or self-conscious Ron. And all you have to do is ask my wife and she'll tell you they're completely different human beings. And one goes and the other arrives on the scene, sometimes seemingly unpredictably. Once we start to do more mindfulness practice, we start to see that these separate parts are really quite distinct. And next slide, there's a question, how was your meditation? My friend Trudy Goodman puts it this way. She says, well, there was part of me trying to attend to the breath, part of me fantasizing about the future, a part of me judging myself. We better ask the committee because it doesn't feel as though there's simply one person in there. Now, this has enormous implications for psychotherapy because when we reject one part of our personality, one behavioral pattern, one set of feelings, we get ourselves into trouble. Let me give you an example. We're going to describe this in terms of Jung's shadow, so that slide, please. If I like to think of myself as being generous, hardworking, and intelligent, I'm going to have a lot of trouble with my greedy, lazy, and dumb side. And every time I do something that makes me feel greedy, lazy, or dumb, I'm going to get all defensive or self-punitive about it. Or worse, if I'm in an interpersonal interaction and the other person does something that highlights this aspect of my experience or my personality, I'm going to get all defensive and hostile toward them. It's not going to go well. In fact, identifying with some parts of the personality while eschewing others is actually a mild form of dissociation. Our defensiveness causes us to block out parts of our experience. And in so doing, we wind up being disconnected from important parts of ourselves and always being in a sense of defensive stress or tension as we're blocking these things out. As we take up mindfulness practices, we realize instead that we're all bozos on this bus. And we have a slide to illustrate that. I'll give you an example. If we're looking out at a field of dandelions, we tend to say, oh, what a lovely field of dandelions. We don't tend to say, well, it's a lovely field of dandelions, but the really special dandelion, the celebrity, the one who I want to know, is actually the 243rd row from the front, 17 in from the left. That's a beautiful model dandelion. And the others kind of play supporting roles. And yet with human beings, this is how we tend to see it, right? We tend to gravitate towards some, not pay attention to others. And when we're doing this, we're cutting off parts of ourselves and we're reducing our freedom. So, it's said in the Zen tradition that Zen is not a path to perfection, but it's a path to wholeness and freedom. And a Zen patriarch once said that the boundary of what we can accept in ourselves is the boundary of our freedom. So if we stop identifying with me as a coherent entity, but see all these different selves arising and passing at different moments, we're going to be much, much freer and much more whole because we're going to be able to accept all these different parts. And indeed, a lot of my psychotherapeutic work is oriented around helping people to reintegrate all the split off parts that have been split off because they're associated with pain, they were associated with shame, and the like. So now let's look at the third big way that understanding no self or anatta can help us in our personal lives and development and in psychotherapeutic work. And this is getting some freedom from self-esteem concerns. I'm totally amazed that here I am in my 60s, having practiced mindfulness and exploring Western and Buddhist psychology since I was a kid. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm still constantly going up and down narcissistically. I've gone up and down half a dozen times since I started this presentation thinking, oh, I forgot to mention this on the slide. Oh, I better go back. Uh-oh, I stumbled. Oh, that went well. I like that story. This stuff is going through my mind even as I'm talking to you. And sometimes I think, oh, this is only happening to me because I was picked on in junior high by some big kids, or maybe because I really am inadequate. But other times I realize I'm not completely alone here, and this is a more universal human problem. It's been terribly neglected clinically, even though the data says that self-esteem problems are getting worse, not better sociologically, and we'll get to that. Freud and Jung touched on it. Alfred Adler wrote about it when he talked about the inferiority complex, but it really hasn't been explored very much at all. And in mindfulness practice, we see how our attempts to buttress our self-esteem, our attempts to feel good about ourselves, cause untold suffering. Next slide, self-evaluation, please. And look at this picture. Some people say this reminds them of a certain well-known political figure. I'm not sure who they may be referring to. But all of us are involved in this constant stream of self-evaluation. And it appears that this is our evolutionary heritage. It turns out that all warm-blooded mammals organize themselves into dominance hierarchies, into pecking orders. And I remember traveling around in Africa once. I was going on they call them safaris, but they're really, nature trips in which you ride in a jeep and a naturalist explains things to you. And a pattern kept emerging, and it was remarkable how many species manifested the same pattern. There would be some dominant male hanging around with a group of reproductively particularly promising females. Then over in the next field, there would be a group of somewhat younger males, often adolescents, doing the species-specific equivalent of playing basketball, getting up their abilities, increasing their skills in the hopes that they can topple the dominant male and take over his role and have more reproductive access. And what we find, what the people who study animal behavior find, is that in these pecking orders, in these dominance hierarchies, those who have higher rank have better access to resources, food, and the like, and they also have greater access to reproductive opportunities. So we might imagine that in our prehistory, there were some happy hominids hanging around the campfire, holding hands, singing Kumbaya in an egalitarian situation, supporting one another compassionately, and not being particularly concerned with dominance or social rank. They, by and large, however, were not our ancestors because they didn't get to reproduce as much as the ones who were able to elevate their rank. We inherited the DNA from hominids that were very interested in social rank, and it shows up in us in self-esteem concerns. And the slide now, please. What realms define me? What's so interesting is that we all get hooked on different things, different symbolic representations of our social rank. And let's look at a few of them together and see what you notice in your own experience. Let's start with skills and talents. Have you ever thought about these things or felt concerns when you're comparing yourself to others or simply going in the world? Who's smarter? Am I smart enough? Who's more educated? Am I educated enough? Who's more talented in some other realm? Perhaps who's more creative? Who has a better sense of style? Who's more cultured or more worldly or more athletically skilled? And you may notice that sometimes at one point in our lives, like athletic skill plays a huge role if you're, in the 5th grade on the playground, maybe not so much in your 50s. These different parameters or these different criteria play different roles at different times in our development. Another whole area, accomplishments. Who has more money? This is a huge one in our culture. Who's more respected? Who has the better looking, better behaved, or more successful children? Who has the better looking, better behaved, or more successful spouse? Whose kids went or are going to a better school? Who has the more advanced degree? I hang around with psychotherapists. Who's in more demand as a psychotherapist? Who has higher status, clients or patients? Who gets paid more for his or her work? Another category, pedigree or group membership. People compare themselves all the time, my group to your group. Who comes from a better family? Grew up on the better side of the tracks? Who lives in a better neighborhood? Went to a better college? Perhaps it's about popularity this way. Who's more well-liked? Who has more friends? Who's more part of the in-group? And dare I say, for those of you who are mental health professionals, have you noticed any status differences or feelings about who's the psychologist, the nurse, the psychiatrist, the social worker, the counselor, or the coach? Ever notice different privileges going with these different statuses? Ever notice feelings arising about this? This stuff is quite powerful. There are other realms too. There's moral standing, right? Who's nicer? Who's more honest? Who has more integrity? Who's more generous or more forgiving? And if you hang around with meditators or people who are in pursuing spiritual practice, this gets downright ridiculous because it becomes, who's more spiritual? Who makes fewer comparisons to others? Who's less concerned with social rank and prestige? It's all the same energies, just getting applied to different realms. And of course, a huge one in our society is appearance, right? Who's prettier or better looking? Who's more handsome? Who's thinner? Who's taller? Who's sexier or hotter? Who's stronger or more physically fit? Who's younger looking? Now, assuming that your mind makes comparisons around at least some of these, as indeed mine does, do you always win? I once asked that question to a group of psychotherapists, and a guy raised his hand, and I thought, avoid him at lunch, right? That's a very bad sign if somebody always wins. Because most of us, of course, go up and down and up and down. And what I'd like to suggest is that this concern with how we compare with others and all these different things is actually a vestige of when social rank was particularly important to be able to have enough to eat and to have a chance of reproductive success. The same way that we are evolutionarily hardwired to like fat and sugar. So much to our detriment, it makes donuts very appealing in the modern era. But we have plenty of access to fat and sugar, at least most of us do in the developed world. And the problem instead is how to not act on the impulse to eat fat and sugar. In the same way, this concern with social rank had great evolutionary benefit for our ancestors, but now in the modern world, it mostly makes us miserable. And our task becomes, is there a way to disentangle from it the same way that we can watch the feeling of liking donuts arise but not feel compelled to eat them? Can we watch our concerns about this arise but not feel compelled to try to solve the problem by raising our social rank, looking better in the eyes of others, and all of the things that we relentlessly do trying to feel better about ourselves? Now, this takes so many different forms in different people. And one of the interesting things we can do clinically is to begin to examine which of these different criteria matter to us as an individual. I'll give you just one quick clinical example. I was working with a guy who was very hooked on money and success and having a good car and that kind of stuff, and he wasn't living up to his own expectations, and he was quite distressed about this. And I took the chance. It was actually at the time when my twin daughters were applying to college, and during a relatively brief period there, what college people went to and what college their kids were going to was an enormously important criteria in social ranking for me. I was very attuned to this. And I'd go up and down hearing about other kids who were going to, other people who had gone to or whose kids were going to more prestigious institutions and all of that. And I actually shared it with him just to let him know how easy it is to get hooked on different things. And I shared it with him knowing that he was a guy who was into money and power and status. And he'd think, college, what does that matter? What matters is how much money you make. And it was very useful for him to see that I was hooked on this and he was hooked on something else, to give a sense that this might be arbitrary. And something similar happened. There's a woman I was working with, and she was an ex-model. And she was very attuned to clothing and appearance, as you might expect. And she had actually felt kind of mortified because she had gone to a bar mitzvah on Long Island wearing the wrong level of designer dress. And she had spent $1,400 on this dress, and it was the wrong level for that event. And for me, I didn't even know that designer dresses come in different levels. The reality is Costco is my tailor, and I'm really not attuned to this stuff. So it's very, very interesting to start to see how arbitrary the particular symbols of social status are that we each get caught up on. So here's a little exercise I'd like you to try right now. We've gone through all these different possible criteria, and there are many more that you might pay attention to in terms of your self-esteem or feeling okay about yourself or not, or comparing yourself to others. And I'd like you to think of one of them that's particularly salient. Something that this one does get to me, and I feel good when I feel I'm doing well in this realm, and I don't feel good when I don't feel I'm doing well in this realm. And I want you to remember a time where your self-esteem went up around this, where this quality, attribute, or ability was validated in some way, and your self-esteem got a little boost. Can you remember that time? And now can you notice what that feels like in the body? Where do you feel a self-esteem boost? For me, it's a feeling in my chest. My chest actually kind of puffs up a little bit. My spine gets a little straighter, my head's held a little higher, and I feel I'm special in some good way. Now consider this. Remember a time, or imagine a time where the opposite happened, where you felt less than others, where you felt like, hey, this quality or criteria, I'm not so good at this or in this way. Or you felt ashamed about it. And how did that feel? How'd the self-esteem collapse feel? For me, it's this kind of feeling in my chest. My whole body kind of collapses. My head droops forward a little bit. Much less pleasant. Then reflect on how many things we each do to try to maintain this feeling and get rid of this feeling. And how much of the world's activity revolves around that. It's really quite remarkable. Let's go to the next slide, the Lake Wobegon slide. One of the terrible problems with self-esteem is it's completely impossible to continue to win unless you live in Lake Wobegon, where, as Garrison Keillor said, all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all of the children are above average. Because, of course, what happens is sometimes we win and sometimes we lose. And it's really quite funny, the things we do to try to keep up the feeling of winning. There's study after study about something that's actually called in social psychology the Lake Wobegon effect. And it refers to the way in which we overestimate our abilities to try to feel good about ourselves. For example, there was a study where 87% of MBA students at Stanford rated their academic performance as above the median. Or at the University of Nebraska, 68% of the faculty rated themselves in the top 25% of teaching ability, and 90% thought they were above average. And there are wonderful studies of drivers. 93% of American drivers think they're above average for safety. That's even after they've had an at-fault accident. And the real kicker is that the vast majority of us think we're above average in our capacity for objectively evaluating ourselves. So we do all this stuff to try to build ourselves up. But the problem is it's absolutely impossible to win consistently. And this is largely because of narcissistic recalibration. Think of something that you once felt would be an important developmental milestone, and when you got there, you were going to feel good about ourselves. This can start very early. When I learned to walk, when I learned to ride a bike, can go to the store alone, or maybe graduate from elementary school or junior high or college, or maybe have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Boy, the first girlfriend or boyfriend, how did that feel in terms of self-esteem when the desired other wanted us? Or buying a house or having a child. And many of you, of course, have college degrees or advanced degrees and perhaps even professional licenses. Let's take the college degrees or professional license. Working for that was a big deal. And we all kind of felt, wow, when I get there, I'm going to feel good about myself. I'm just curious, how many of you awoke this morning feeling, I feel so fulfilled, I have my professional degree or license? Probably not so many, right? And on top of this, there's the horrible kicker. Have you noticed any changes in your body since you were 20? Have you welcomed and embraced them all? Yeah, probably not. Joseph Campbell put it so nicely. This is the wrong wall picture, slide, if you will. He said, many people climb the ladder of success only to discover that it's leaning up against the wrong wall. And so much of that, or so much of what's on the wrong wall is our pursuit of trying to self-improvement in the sense of improving our self-esteem in some way. And so many of the things we go after don't work well. Thorstein Veblen was an economist in 1899. He wrote a wonderful book called The Theory of the Leisure Class, where he identified something called conspicuous consumption. He was the first economist to notice that people buy stuff not because they need them, or not even because they like the aesthetics, but because they want to see that other people see that they can buy stuff. And think of all the luxury goods that fit this category. Where I fly, I do a lot of teaching, and, I love the airlines ranking systems. You get online, and first the executive platinum plus passengers get on, followed by the platinum, and then the gold, and then the silver. And God forbid you should be one of the 8 lumpen proletariat to board the plane at the end with no status at all. This stuff is just everywhere we look. And it turns out it's getting worse. And it's getting worse. Slide, please. There have been many, many studies of this showing that millennials and the following generation are much more concerned with narcissism and self-esteem. The dream of winning the lottery, becoming a reality TV star, founding a startup, or becoming rich by the age of 30 is a very prevalent dream. And there's all sorts of reasons for this that have been documented, everything from helicopter parents who are making sure everything's okay for their kids to grade inflation. I love the grade inflation statistics. In 1968, 18% of high school students got an A. By the year 2004, 48% had an A average. There's a wonderful measure of this. I'll just share it with you because it's so striking. There's an instrument called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, and let's go to that slide. And it has forced choice questions, okay? So what it means is you take this test, it's got 40 choices, and they come in pairs. And you have to decide between these pairs which one most describes you. I'll give you an example of a few. They're on the slide. Choose which is more true. I just want to be reasonably happy, or I want to amount to something in the eyes of the world. This is my favorite, the next one. If I ruled the world, it would be a better place, versus the thought of ruling the world scares the hell out of me. Or I'm much like everybody else, versus I'm an extraordinary person. Or I like this one especially as a therapist. I always know what I'm doing, or sometimes I'm not sure of what I'm doing. Well, it turns out that our preoccupation with narcissism and our preoccupation with self-esteem and our social rank here has been so growing that scores on this narcissistic personality inventory are increasing exponentially. Well, not exponentially, but in a very steep curve. Take a look at this slide. This is from a study called Egos Inflating Over Time, a cross-temporal meta-analysis of the narcissistic personality inventory. And you can see the scores there from 1980 up to this last one went 2005, 2006, but it's actually been studied past this and it keeps going up. And interestingly, this is tracking in America the obesity epidemic, which has caused the authors to say even our egos are getting fat. And it's not making us happy. So what might we do about this? I've certainly laid out the problem. Well, there's a number of techniques that I'd like to share with you. One of them is simply trying yourself and encouraging your clients or patients to write a self-esteem autobiography. And the method in this is quite simple. You simply start with the earliest memory you have, and you can begin it in your own mind right now. What's your earliest memory of either feeling, hey, I'm good, or I'm special, or I'm liked, or there's something that gives us a self-esteem boost? And what was the earliest memory of that? And can you remember the earliest memory of a self-esteem collapse, where the roller coaster went the other way and you felt inadequate, inferior to somebody, not good enough in some fashion? And the self-esteem autobiography involves simply doing this and extending it over your entire lifetime. It takes a long time to write one of these because what we discover is, my God, there are so many ups and downs, and so many of those ups and downs have been so formative for us. Interestingly, the fellow who I mentioned before, who was all concerned with getting his cars and getting a car and a fancy house and a lot of money, when he wrote a self-esteem autobiography, he realized that, gosh, he had so many moments of humiliation as a kid, so many moments in which he felt that he was less than. He had older brothers who picked on him and a pretty narcissistic father that contributed to the problem. And then later, moments of being with some beautiful young woman who then rejects him, that this stuff was so painful that he started to see how the desperation for winning narcissistically was really about trying to make that pain go away. Now, here's another way you can do it. Let's look at the next slide, please. So I had a fellow who I was working with. He was a teacher, school teacher, who lived in a very prosperous part of Boston. And it so happened that his grandfather had been wealthy and his mother had inherited that money. And now she was actually had Alzheimer's, and he was managing her affairs. And he also had access to her resources, and he was going to inherit the money. So it was fine for him to use it. And indeed, he had used it to live in this affluent section of the Boston area, where everybody else were like university presidents, heads of hospitals, they ran media outlets, and he'd go to social events in the neighborhood and felt inadequate, felt like, well, the rest of them, they earned this, and I just got there, and I'm just a teacher, and I just got there from my family. And I started asking him, so what's the place where you feel most below them? And he said, well, it's because I got the money from my mother, And I said, so I want you to practice a little mantra, just silently to yourself whenever you're at the party. And the mantra was this: I get my money from mommy. And, initially, of course, it's devastating to do that. But as we start to play with it, we realize, so I get my money from mommy. So much of the time we're trying to avoid the self-esteem collapse. If we can actually face these things that bring on the self-esteem collapse and even start to play with them, it starts to loosen this up for us. Okay, the fourth area that I'd like to mention is the way in which understanding non-self and understanding the way in which we construct ourselves and understanding the ways in which we are hooked on these self-esteem things and these evaluative judgments can actually help us to connect to other human beings. Next slide, please. This one speaks for itself. The end is near, you wish. You ever notice the way a 5-minute interaction with a loved one can really ruin your day? Very often what's gone wrong is we've hurt each other's feelings around some self-esteem issue. One person has made the other one feel diminished in some way or another. And there's a very curious relationship here between love relationships and self-esteem. And let's look at the slide that depicts the two of them. Here's how this works. Remember back again, I had asked you to think about this, to a first boyfriend or girlfriend. And remember how powerful a self-esteem boost it was to experience the other as the other who we're valuing so much ourselves as wanting or liking us or wanting to be with us sexually, and how good we feel about ourselves. So we get these tremendous self-esteem boosts from this. But of course, the opposite, when we lose the other, becomes quite a problem. It becomes quite the collapse. And the other way that this arrow works, of course, is that most of us have the fantasy that what we need in order to be attractive to the other is we need to be very desirable ourselves. So we need to have whatever the quality is. Either I need a lot of money, or I need to be really buff, or I need to be really kind, or I need to be really generous, or I need to be really hot and sexy, or I need to be really young looking. Whatever it is that we think is attracting the other to us, we get all hooked on our self-esteem issues because we need them. We imagine we need that for the other person to want us. The next slide. So I have a patient of mine who said to me at one point, there's another variation on how this messes up our relationships. She said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you is not just, a commandment or a religious injunction. It's a law of nature. And this has to do with judging. And let's look at the next slide, when it says judgments and the picture of the woods here. And this is something I actually heard first from Ram Dass, who many of you know, who wrote Be Here Now and led many in my generation into forays into spiritual practice. And Ram Dass points out that when we walk through the woods and we see all of these different, trees, we don't tend to judge the trees so much. Some are tall and straight, some are fat, some are wrinkly, some have cancerous growths on them, some have lost branches, some are lying on the ground, rotting and, with fungi growing on them. And we don't tend to judge the trees. We tend to take the totality of the forest as a beautiful thing. But the second we walk out of the forest and we get into the human realm, we start judging everybody. Who's attractive, who's not attractive, who's nice, who's not nice, who looks healthy, not so healthy, who's of a higher status, of a lower status, who's has ideas and philosophies like me, who has ideas and philosophies like, for example, the other political party. And it is fascinating to see how these judgments wind up separating us from others. And the thing about the do unto others as you would to yourself is the more we judge others, the more we wind up judging ourselves. Because the same judgmental attitude, of course, carries over to ourselves. And the more we judge ourselves, the more we judge others. So one of the advantages of mindfulness practice is it allows us to see these judgments coming and going as thoughts. And as we see that, we might not identify with them in the same way, might not believe in them in the same way, and that might give us a path to actually connect to others. Next slide, please. It's interesting. So often as a clinician, I've worked with people who were either preparing to go on a date or they were going on a job interview and they had butterflies. They were afraid of how it would go. And I don't know where I came across this, but a very useful suggestion is to make a connection, not an impression. And this is interesting because when we're interacting with other people, we can monitor how much of my energy is going into impressing the other, hoping they think highly of me, versus connecting with the other. And there are wonderful studies on popularity about this. They're basically popularity matters in terms of human well-being, but there are two avenues to it. One of them is status-based, and that's when we're trying to impress the other, and it'll work. It'll sometimes get people to give us a job, or sometimes get people to date us or want to be our friend. But people who use status as the way to connect tend to crash and burn eventually. People who use likability, which is basically making a connection to the other, being interested in the other, have much better outcomes. So another way that we can approach this non-self idea and stepping off the self-esteem roller coaster is by really working in every interaction toward making a connection rather than an impression. And ultimately, it's about other people. You know, what the self-esteem literature what the literature in positive psychology tells us, which is basically the study of, is happiness possible? And this was the movement from clinical psychology and psychiatry, which were kind of about moving people from -5 to 0, you know, dealing with the symptom and getting rid of the symptom, looking at, is flourishing actually possible? And Chris Peterson, who was one of the founders of this movement, and he passed away, sadly, some years ago, but before he died, he said, well, we've discovered something. It's about other people. And it's about connecting to other people and loving other people, basically, and appreciating our common humanity. Next slide. It's and one way to do that, another method, and this is, you know, well worn or well described in spiritual traditions, is through service. Because in the moment when we're serving another person, and if that's our focus, we're a little less focused on how am I doing, and a little bit more focused on how can I be helpful to this other person. So I'm looking at our time. So let's click on the bottom arrow. That's just a way for us to advance through a few slides here. And I think we should be at a slide called Therapeutic Progress. So one way to think about psychotherapy without a self is to help ourselves and our clients or patients to move from a basic orientation in which a lot of things are about me. How am I doing? Who am I? How can I get rid of pain? How can I have more pleasure? While a little bit is not about me, to much more of our consciousness not being about me and mine. Of course, there'll be consciousness about me and mine, but particularly to step off the roller coaster of constant evaluation of this. And this is a brief presentation. I haven't been able to get into the many other ways to do this. There are ways to do this by pondering our insignificance, by spending time pondering mortality and how brief this trip is through the life cycle and how terrible our prognosis is. You can do this through practicing deliberate acts of compassion and self-compassion, where you generate doing loving kindness meditation and self-compassion exercises where you're taking care of yourself and offering love to yourself while offering love to others. So there are many other methods as well, but I hope this has given you at least a glimpse into some possibilities and what psychotherapy might be like if it's not so much about self-improvement, but rather about grasping non-self. Now I'll leave you with this thought. Why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one. And that's from Wei Wu Wei, he was a British Taoist scholar who wrote under that pseudonym. So if you're interested, if those of you who aren't doing mindfulness meditation regularly, and this I would hope might interest you in that, one source of recorded meditations and a lot more about the topic of mindfulness and how it can be useful to us could be found at mindfulnesssolution.com, which is a website associated with one of my books. And there's my email as well. And thank you for your kind attention.